We are taught that the Cold War began in 1945, rising from the ashes of a defeated Germany. We are taught wrong. The defining geopolitical conflict of the 20th century didn't start at Yalta, and it didn't start with the atomic bomb. It started before World War II even began, with a single secret signature between mortal enemies. Moscow, August 23, 1939. Two men bent over a table and signed their names, while a third watched from the shadows. Vyacheslav Molotov, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and Joseph Stalin, standing just far enough back to look like a witness rather than an architect. No Soviet soldier crossed a border that night. No Red Army artillery fired a single shell. No blood was shed in any conventional sense. Yet within 2 years, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and eastern Poland had been absorbed into the Soviet sphere. Soviet influence had extended deep into the Balkans. An entire geography had been redrawn, quietly, surgically, in a single evening's paperwork. This is the moment that Central Intelligence Agency sourced analysts would later characterize not Hiroshima, not the Berlin airlift, not the first Soviet nuclear test, as the true beginning of the Cold War. Not 1945, 1939. Consider what Stalin actually accomplished that night. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918 had carved away the western borderlands of the old Russian Empire, a humiliation the Bolsheviks never forgave and never forgot. For 2 decades, those lost territories sat just beyond Soviet reach. Then came the Pact, and they came back. Not through invasion, not through open war, through a secret protocol buried inside a non-aggression agreement that the world was never supposed to know existed. The conventional history argues that the Cold War began when the wartime alliance collapsed, when Truman and Stalin glared at each other across Potsdam in 1945, when Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri. That history is incomplete in a way that fundamentally distorts everything that followed. The Grand Alliance of 1941 to 1945 was not the story. It was the interruption. Hitler's invasion forced Stalin into a temporary partnership with the powers he had been maneuvering against for years. But the objectives never changed. Even while Soviet soldiers died alongside Allied weapons and Allied supplies, Stalin's war aims remained fixed on something older than the fight against fascism. He was fighting to legitimize what the Pact had already given him, to make permanent what a single night in Moscow had made possible. Western governments understood some of this. What they did not fully grasp, or chose not to, was how deep the blueprint actually ran. The Pact did not just establish a border, it established an intention. And that intention would define Soviet foreign policy for the next 52 years. To understand why Stalin walked away from that table in Moscow with an empire, you have to understand what he believed had been stolen from Russia 21 years earlier. The Soviet territorial ambitions that shaped the 20th century did not originate with Stalin. They were inherited. The Tsarist Empire had spent centuries pushing outward, absorbing buffer territories, reaching toward warm water ports, pressing against every frontier until geography itself seemed to resist. That expansion came to a violent halt in 1918, when the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk stripped Russia of Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, and Ukraine in a single humiliating settlement. The Bolsheviks signed because they had no choice, but they never accepted what they had signed. When the Bolshevik Revolution succeeded in 1917, Western governments did not send diplomats. They sent soldiers. British, French, American, and Japanese forces intervened in the Russian Civil War between 1917 and 1920, backing the White Army in an explicit attempt to strangle the new Soviet state before it could consolidate power. The intervention failed, but what it produced was something more durable than military defeat. It produced a doctrine. From that moment forward, Soviet foreign policy operated on a foundational assumption that the capitalist West would always seek Russia's destruction, and that any accommodation was tactical, never principled. That assumption did not wait for 1945 to generate consequences. The undeclared spy war began the moment Western governments refused recognition. Soviet intelligence operations against European capitals and American institutions were already underway before most Western citizens had heard of the Comintern. When Stalin consolidated absolute power from 1924 onward, he did not invent this apparatus. He industrialized it. Espionage networks expanded across Europe and deep into the United States, building infrastructure that would remain operational for generations. This is what makes the Pact of 1939 so precise in its architecture. It was not improvised. It was the culmination of a 20-year strategic project, the careful accumulation of grievance, intelligence, and leverage, all pointed at a single objective: reclaim what Brest-Litovsk had stripped away, reconstruct the borderlands, restore the buffer territories, and do it without triggering a war that the Soviet Union, in 1939, could not yet afford to win. Stalin had spent 2 decades building the tools. The Pact gave him the moment to use them. By 1939, Stalin had the territory. He had the intelligence networks. What he did not have yet was a way to make the world accept what he had taken. That problem would require a war he did not start, but intended to finish on his own terms. The bloodless territorial conquest of 1939 had a problem Stalin had not fully accounted for. Inside Soviet prison camps sat thousands of Polish military officers captured when the Red Army swept into eastern Poland under the cover of the Pact. These were not conscripts. They were trained professionals. Commanders, engineers, intelligence officers, men who knew the forests and river crossings of the territories Moscow had just claimed as its own. Stalin looked at them and saw not prisoners. He saw a fuse. In the spring of 1940, the Narodny Commissariat Vnutrenych Del, the Soviet secret police known as the NKVD, executed those men at Katyn and at other sites across Western Russia. The killings were methodical, unhurried, and total. A bullet to the back of the skull, repeated thousands of times, in a forest that would keep the secret for decades. This was not random brutality. The logic behind it was strategic and coldly precise. Stalin feared a coordinated Franco-British military thrust through Finland, a military operation that had been openly discussed in Western capitals during the Winter War. If that thrust came, and if the Polish prisoners organized, the Soviet grip on its newly acquired eastern territories could fracture along every seam. The men in those camps knew the terrain intimately. They had trained on it, mapped it, commanded soldiers across it. Stalin did not wait to find out if they would act. He removed them permanently. What the Katyn massacre reveals is something historians of the Cold War rarely name directly. The operational patterns that would define Soviet security doctrine for the next 50 years were already running in 1940, 5 years before the Cold War is said to have officially begun. Preemptive elimination of potential resistance. Covert internal security operations designed to neutralize human obstacles to borders drawn by political fiat. The suppression of populations whose continued existence represented a standing challenge to Soviet territorial claims. The Pact had not just given Stalin land. It had given him a problem set, and he was already solving it the only way his system knew how. Katyn was the first major example. It would not be the last. The Cold War's darkest operational logic was not born in 1945. It was field-tested in a forest in 1940, and it worked. If you appreciate deep dives into the hidden mechanics of history like this, take a second to hit subscribe to the channel. Because Stalin had just successfully secured his invisible empire, But then Hitler made his mistake. And Stalin, who had been winning a Cold War since 1939, was suddenly forced to fight a hot one. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1941, tore the Pact apart overnight. 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory, and Stalin's carefully constructed geopolitical architecture cracked under the weight of a war he had not wanted yet. The comfortable arrangement he had drawn up with Ribbentrop, the one that had handed him an empire without a single artillery shell fired in anger, was gone. What replaced it was the Grand Alliance, a partnership with Britain and the United States that looked from the outside like a genuine convergence of interests. It was not. It never was. Hitler had failed to reach a negotiated peace with Britain. That failure mattered enormously, because the Pact had been designed to exploit a Western stalemate, to keep the capitalist powers grinding each other down while Stalin consolidated his eastern territories. Without that stalemate, the architecture collapsed. The alliance with the West was a tactical necessity, not a geopolitical alignment. Stalin needed the industrial capacity and the Second Front. He did not need the partnership. There is a difference. The Soviet war aims were not abstract. They were territorial. The primary objective was to restore and legitimize the frontiers seized under the Pact: the Baltic absorptions, the eastern Polish territories, the Balkan inroads. Every inch of ground the Red Army retook from Germany was ground Stalin intended to keep, not liberate. The liberation framing was for Western consumption. The operational reality was consolidation, and the Western allies knew enough to be uncomfortable. Poland was fighting alongside Britain from the first days of the war. The Baltic governments maintained diplomatic presences in London and Washington. These were allies of the Western powers, and the Western powers were simultaneously fighting alongside the state that had absorbed or targeted those same governments. The blueprint the Pact had drawn was still active. It was simply running on a delayed timeline behind a temporary partnership that served Soviet purposes without altering Soviet objectives. The central argument here carries an irony worth sitting with. The anti-Nazi war was not the interruption of the Cold War. It was the cover under which the Cold War's foundational territorial claims were legitimized by battlefield facts. Stalin instrumentalized the alliance. He used the war to arrive at 1945, holding the same map he had drawn in 1939, but now with the moral authority of an Allied victor. When Western historians examined the Soviet satellite states assembled after 1945, many assumed Stalin had improvised. Poland subjugated. The Baltics absorbed. Eastern Europe sealed behind what Churchill would call an iron curtain. The assumption was intuitive: a shattered continent, an opportunistic dictator, chaos exploited in real time. It was also completely wrong. The blueprint had been drawn between 1939 and 1941. Every border, every buffer state, every suppressed government traced its geometry directly back to the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The satellite empire that stunned Western observers after 1945 was not improvised from rubble. It was excavated from it. Stalin had not seized opportunity. He had executed a plan that was already 6 years old. That distinction matters more than it first appears. An improvised empire is a product of circumstance. A planned one is a product of intention. And intention changes everything about who started what and when. The suppression of Poland had been a stated Soviet objective during the war itself, meaning Western allies had spent 4 years fighting alongside a power that was simultaneously planning to absorb their other allies' territories. The war had not interrupted Stalin's geopolitical program. It had provided cover for it. The anti-Nazi alliance was the interlude. The territorial expansion was the mission. Then came the revision. Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti, vetted memoirs of Soviet intelligence officer Alexander Feklisov, reviewed over a 10-year period from 1987 to 1997, carried a striking argument. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Feklisov's account insisted, had been forced on the Soviet Union by Western powers who deliberately incited Hitler against Moscow. The pact was not offensive, it was defensive. Joseph Stalin had not reached for empire. He had reached for survival. Analysts called it Stalinist propaganda, an inversion of the historical record so complete it functioned almost as a confession through negation. But the propaganda itself was the evidence. The Soviet state, even in its final decade, needed the pact to be a defensive act. The entire apparatus of post-war legitimacy depended on it. Because if the pact was offensive, then the Cold War had not begun in 1945 with Western containment policy. It had begun in 1939 in a Moscow signing room with Stalin as the architect, not the defender. That vulnerability was structural. It never went away. Every territorial claim Stalin made after 1945 silently referenced the secret protocols. Every satellite state was a line item from a document the Soviet Union spent decades pretending did not exist. George Kennan published The Sources of Soviet Conduct in 1947. His containment doctrine never lost favor among American policymakers, and many analysts credit it with ultimately closing the arc. But here is what those analysts rarely say plainly. Containment was never aimed at Soviet ideology alone. It was aimed at specific territorial facts: the absorbed Baltic states, the subjugated Poland, the Eastern European sphere locked into place between 1939 and 1941. Kennan was responding to a map, and that map had been drawn in Moscow on a single August evening 8 years before his doctrine had a name. That is a minority position against the mainstream consensus. Most historians still date the Cold War's beginning to the post-war collapse of the Grand Alliance, but the CIA sourced analysis that characterizes 1939 as the true beginning is not an outlier argument built on sentiment. It is built on territorial logic. Every post-war confrontation traces its geography back to the secret protocols. Every satellite state was a delayed execution of a pre-war blueprint. The interrupted war was never really interrupted. It resumed. Mikhail Gorbachev warned in 2008 that a new Cold War had already begun. He was not describing an accident. He was describing a structure, one where the territorial and ideological tensions crystallized in 1939 had not dissolved with the Soviet flag. They had simply reconfigured. The spy war itself is older than any of this. It began in 1917, the moment Western governments refused to recognize the Bolshevik Revolution. That undeclared conflict predates Soviet nuclear capability, predates Hiroshima, predates every date commonly offered as the Cold War's origin. The borders drawn in Moscow on August 23, 1939, still generate crises today. The Cold War may have had an official end date. The conflict that started in 1939, the one that actually began everything, has not.